guy up front. JMO up here, the awesome ODL developer in the blue shirt. He has the box of flash drives. So he's the guy to get your locally cached files from. So as people are making their way in, again, I encourage folks, if it's too late now, but maybe during the break, if you realize you can't read the font, or it's too crowded because I'm using too large of a font, please move closer. Then I can use a smaller font, and it'll be better for everybody else. Cool, so we're going to go ahead and dive in. This is the title that I submitted was Deploying Open Daylight. The subtitle was Vagrant, Docker, RPMs, Puppet, Ansible, or oh my. So that is that talk. It just was titled differently than I intended, and the long title doesn't fit on my slides. This is kind of a talk that I've been wanting to give for a long time. I've given a lot of packaging and deployment talks because we kind of led that charge during the last release cycle. But they're all like 45-minute ones, right? So I'm always jamming everything into 45 minutes. Can't really touch anything hands-on, which I think is pretty important for learning in that amount of time. So this is kind of the all things Open Daylight packaging and deployment talk that have been talked about over beers for a long time, and now it's finally happening. Before we do that, though, a quick introduction to me. Let me go ahead and full screen this so because we won't need the shell for a minute. So I code a lot. My name's Daniel Farrell. I'm a software engineer on Red Hat's SDN team. I code a lot on various projects. I'm a committer on Open Daylight's integration team, where I do a lot of coding and code reviews. It's a great community in general. I love robotics. I lead a robotics team at North Carolina State University and advise that team now. Sometimes I like talking about robotics over beer. In general, I love craft beer. Do a lot of beer tourism or other interesting drinks if alcohol is not your thing. I associate as a pedal biker in Raleigh, North Carolina, so there's a great biking scene there, great community. Highly recommend checking out our group rides at some point if you can. Sometimes I'm able to combine hobbies like biking and scuba diving on the right, or being outdoors and coding on the left. Cool, so super quick outline of today's talk. Again, it's kind of an all things packaging and deployment. So we're going to touch on every relevant tool, every relevant packaging way, RPMs, Docker images, Vagrant files. And then we're going to, so I'll talk about it for a while, and then we'll do a hands-on part for each of them. The hands-on part is difficult in the sense that it's been difficult for me to get it all set up, so hopefully it won't be difficult for you. So hopefully it'll all work out super well for you, and all the dependencies will be locally cached, and we won't have to touch the network at all. But if anything breaks there, it's probably my fault setting up that dependency stuff, but not the actual tools. To do all of that local dependency caching and preventing you all from having to spend 5 hours installing things on your laptops, I've created a very simple Git repository called the PackDep Toolbox, Packaging and Deployment Toolbox, that contains some Vagrant file definitions. There's the toolbox that we'll be making use throughout the day. We're also going to be talking about Open Daylight's RPM, which is kind of the foundation of things. Open Daylight's Puppet module, which is widely used by OPNFV and stuff. Open Daylight's Ansible role, which is probably the future of how we're going to do that stuff with OPNFV. Open Daylight's Docker file and image and containers, which are a lot of fun and we're moving to do in more cool ways. Open Daylight's Vagrant Basebox and the Packer configuration that built that Vagrant Basebox, and hopefully will eventually build our Docker images. All right, so before we jump into all of those awesome tools, though, I kind of want to contrast that with a lack of a deployment tool or the manual option. Again, for the people coming in, there's a flash drive going around. This box up here is full of them. Make sure that you have these flash drives. They have all the locally cached files on them. So the manual option in Open Daylight community terms is known as the just download and run option. And that works, that works sometimes, but let's go ahead and try it out and sort of get a feel for it. So for this, slide example at least, we're going to start with a fresh CentOS 7 Vagrant file, which you can create. I'm taking the time, by the way, to teach Vagrant syntax instead of my normal, or all syntax, instead of my normal, fairly fast-paced slides every few seconds. So if you see a pacing issue, that's what's going on. So we can use Vagrant init to create a minimal Vagrant file like this based on a CentOS 7 image upstream. And then boot that virtual machine with Vagrant up, and then connect to it with Vagrant SSH. We can then go grab our favorite download URL, which is Open Daylight's download URL, of course, and curl that down to our Vagrant Basebox. Again, this is the manual install process for Open Daylight for people who are just coming in. We can then make some relevant directories and untar our download archive into that directories, and then go and attempt to start up in Daylight, and oh, we realize we don't have Java installed. So let's go install Java and wait for that to download and install and stuff. Now we can try again to start up in Daylight, and that worked, but we're running as root, so that's fine for some stuff, not great for real deployments. So I guess now we need to create the ODL user group. Do we want a home directory for that user while we're doing it, and other settings and questions you have to figure out? Now we need to go change all the relevant permissions to be appropriate, and then restart the ODL service. If only we had systemd support, that would be really nice. Now we've got to manually log into the craft shell and configure some craft features, do any port configuration, both in Open Daylight's port stuff and through the firewall, and all of that's great and fine for devs. But for automated deployments, especially like big, complicated automated deployments like OPNFV, for first user experiences, modern users, in my opinion, expect better, and we definitely need better for modern automated deployments. That was what drove a lot of this, and it's just a hard requirement of being able to do this in a better way. Cool, so with no further ado, let's go ahead and jump into what I suspect is going to be the least elegant part of this presentation, which is getting you all set up with your dependencies so that we're working in the same shared environment. So again, this is the PackDep toolbox that I'm not great at naming things, by the way, so PackDep is totally up for argument if anyone has a suggestion for a better name there. So it's on GitHub, but you don't need that because it's also cached locally on your system. It defines two virtual machines via Vagrant. One of them is the actual PackDep virtual machine that has a tremendous amount of complicated logic to do a lot of caching. The other one is a cached virtual machine that's fairly simple and hopefully will trade computation and network for lots of storage. And so you guys don't have to spend hours waiting on things to build, or we don't kill our network. So here's the painful part. These are the files that I've included on those USB keys that you all have. So you'll need to go ahead and install them. The ones, I don't really know how to help you with this, by the way, because you all have different operating systems. I walked around and I saw lots of Windows, saw lots of OS X. I validated this works on Linux and OS X. I've not tried it on Windows. Couldn't find a guinea pig. But overall, what you're going to need to do is install VirtualBox and Vagrant and Git and the ability to work with tar archives. And that's pretty simple compared to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dependencies that you would have to install if we hadn't have done the rest of this. So I apologize for this little detour, but once that's done, we'll be good to go, elegance all the rest of the way. So I'm going to walk around. Jamie can walk around. Anybody else can walk around that wants to help and try to answer questions. But we're going to have to take sort of a few minutes of non-presentation time to get that installed in everybody's system. Then we'll all be working from the same common Vagrant environment, and we'll be good to go.
For some of you, if it doesn't work on Linux, you have to put on exFAT queues and exFAT utils. That came up in one of the other sessions. I knew somebody might ask.
So if you could turn my mic off, person, I'm going to go walk around. And so let's take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get this done. If anyone's, as you get done, let me know, I guess. Or try to make that obvious so I know timing-wise. trying to do up here, you're going to end up untarring this large directory that I've distributed, and then if you can run Vagrant status, you probably have most things working. This is kind of your end goal. You guys have these files on your flash drives? All right, well that's exactly the opposite of what I was trying to do. Cool, so I need to go find the guy who wrote all of these flash drives and make sure that there's no magic going on, like we have the right flash drives and stuff. I don't know where he's at. So, yeah, this one should be here, so we can at least do that, but these are moderately large files, so I guess go ahead and attempt to download these, and we'll see if our network can support them. These are not like magic files, they're available on the internet and stuff. So if they're not cached locally on our flash drives like we hoped, then go ahead and hit the network and search for like VirtualBox installer, it'll be very obvious, or Vagrant installer, it'll be very obvious. And these are the files that you end up downloading and installing.
So before we go there, question for you. Is it possible that the tar file has it?
No, the tarball does, it has stuff in it, but it does not have these things in it. Then you're done. You don't have, if you have everything installed, then you don't have to install it. Wait till everybody else has it installed.
What I have here, there's 2 virtual machines here.
Can you turn my mic off? Here's all the VirtualBox downloads. They're maybe 100 megs or something. It's not too crazy, so we should be able to get them down. If anybody's actually downloading it and want to let me know whether the network is working, that'd be cool. Sorry about that. I definitely submitted all of those files to be put on the flash drive, for the record. No, it doesn't. I promise, I created it. It does not. Sorry about that. Slow down. Is everybody still making progress in general? Are we done? Guess this isn't clear. You don't actually have to load any virtual machine into VirtualBox at the moment. We're going to be using Vagrant to work with the virtual machines. And so don't open up the VirtualBox GUI and try to import a virtual machine. That's not what you want to do right now. Just get to the point where you can untar the archive and run Vagrant up, or Vagrant status. This is your objective. Do this. Don't try to import the virtual machine yet. I'll show you how to do that in the next slides. Progress check. Who has Vagrant installed? Who has VirtualBox installed? who doesn't have either of those installed and feels lost and like they're never gonna get this done? All right, well, let's give it a few more minutes, and I'm gonna go, I really would like to talk to Casey, who made these things. I'm gonna go try to find him real fast. So you shouldn't need libvirt. I don't, I mean, yeah? It's weird that it's even looking at libvirt. Think for a second. Do you have, you have VirtualBox installed? Can you run, think for a second. I don't know, I've never had to install that. What OS is this? Interesting. Gosh. Can you try running like Vagrant up? No, you'll have to import it first. That won't work either. It's too complicated. Let me show you a slide real fast. So can you do that box add command right there and see if that works? Yeah, Vagrant box add, name of the box, and then the path to the box. So who has everything installed and is good to go? The download's taking forever. So Casey is the guy who wrote the flash drives. Has gone to try to find flash drives that do have everything on it. So maybe we'll be able to come back and do that. I guess for now, if anyone has it, okay. He has Vagrant on a drive. VirtualBox we need to distribute amongst ourselves somewhere. I'm really sorry for this lag, by the way. This is irritating to me. Yes. Yeah, so don't do this step yet. Yeah, so don't do that yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to teach you other things before you do that. And please stop it so you stop killing the network. You're killing the network right now. If you're downloading something over the network and you don't need to be, please stop.
I've got a few keys right here, about 10 that have the installers on them. If you need them, raise your hand.
Okay, so now you should be able to run up with a provisioner VirtualBox, and it should just stop looking at libvirt. No, there's a provisioner. You'll have to Google this for the syntax because I don't have it in my slides, but it's a provisioner flag, and it'll point it. No, it's still a Vagrant up command, and there's a -- provision or provisioner VirtualBox. But if you Google like the Vagrant, search for like Vagrant provisioner VirtualBox or something, and then that'll show you the right flags. But I guess the issue is that on 22 it's just defaulting to look at libvirt instead of looking at VBox. So you just need to tell it to use the VBox virtualization provider, and then it should be fine. Yeah, it may be a global thing like that too.
All right. So I should delete these things that I installed. You can, these guys, I want it.
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, I didn't download it.
It's not for me. There are other tutorials who have stuff on those drives that I know nothing about, but. Are you downloading it? Yeah. Are you getting it? Is it slowly coming down? Yeah, very slowly.
So this is the, and then you said I should also download Vagrant, right?
Yep, Vagrant and VirtualBox. So the. Okay, good, cool. Good, good. Yep, that should be what you want. So are those flash drives with everything actually cached on it? Are those being distributed effectively? Because we want to get those on and off your hands as quickly as possible. I did not expect this to take nearly as long as it's taking. Yep, so you'll need overall all this. Yep, this is exactly what I would expect. Good.
Directory, and I copy that tar file in the directory.
That's fine.
And then I can do Vagrant in it right there.
Yeah, so once you have it untarred, you'll have it's a Git repository with a Vagrant file defined in it. So if you have everything installed, then you'll be able to run Vagrant commands.
Okay, so
And I'll teach you about that shortly. How's it going over here?
Yeah, I've got VirtualBox since before. I'm just trying to get Vagrant.
Yeah, is it just downloading or?
Trying to do both, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you have one of the keys that allegedly has it?
Allegedly, but
It's not
I couldn't
working?
get to it.
Really?
So
Interesting.
maybe it's my
Somebody else want to try? Do you want to try? Okay. This is one of the keys that should have things cached on it, allegedly, if anyone wants to try it. Maybe. Anyone? Someone has to need this. This has everything cached on it. If you're waiting on a download, you should say, hey, I need this. If no one needs it, then I guess I should ask for a status update. How are we doing on things being installed? Who has VirtualBox installed? Please actually raise your hands. Who has VirtualBox installed? Who doesn't have VirtualBox installed? I should ask it this way. Who doesn't have Vagrant installed? Okay, so almost everyone has VirtualBox installed, maybe half of the people have Vagrant installed. This is a flash drive with things on it. All you Vagrant people. Yeah, that would be a 6 or 7 gig email. I think we definitely have to cache it locally, but. Yeah, I tried that. I asked them about doing that, whether I could require you guys to install this in advance, and they told me I could not. So, yeah.
By the end of the day, all of these files will be on our wiki. All the files will be there. They'll be there before noon. I know that doesn't help right now.
It was all so good if it had just been cached.
The first summit, we got everything in the pen, but then what happened, there was an error copying a file. We got an underscore, it went a dash, and then nobody could install VMs. Until we figured out the problem,
Yeah.
like we spent like minimum 30 minutes not doing nothing, just figure out why this doesn't load, why it doesn't work.
This is not that bad at least,
So
right?
it's always like that. So no worries.
All right, thanks, man.
This is normal. The good thing you get the 2 hours slot, which is
To fix
longer
stuff like
than
this.
the other, so you
Sure.
can fix more stuff in this spot.
Thanks, man. That makes me feel a little better. How's it going? Okay. The flash drives are slow too, huh?
Yeah,
Great. Perfect.
12 minutes.
12 minutes, really.
Flash drive copy.
Excellent. All right, well, I think, interesting. Let's go ahead and.
Installing the Vagrant, what do I see?
What do you mean? What do you see?
I installed it, but I don't see it.
So the sort of test is what I've got up here. So once you untar this directory, if you can navigate to it, and then it won't be the same interface because you're on Windows, but via whatever Vagrant's interface is, run something to the effect of like Vagrant status and verify that Vagrant is in fact installed and working. And if that works, then that's kind of your canary that things are good to go. No, so there are other files on the drives that are related to other tutorials. You can totally ignore all of those. The one that starts with packdep is the only one on most of the drives that matters. The other installers are on a few drives. Here's a drive that has stuff cached. Anyone else need a cached drive? I know you do. I know someone needs these. Yeah, sure.
Which one do I install?
So there's only going to be one that's. This is the one. This is the cache one.
I got the USB drive.
Yeah, and this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
Really. So there should be other ones too. These are a dev and an RPM. I tried to distribute all of the files listed here. So what I was expecting you to be able to use this .msi file, and if that's not available, yeah, try this one, I guess. I'm really sorry about this flash drive stuff. It's out of my control. Hey, JMO. Is there an MSI file for Vagrant on the cache ones?
Lewis had one, and it's only on the ones he was expecting. So
He was expecting.
not the ones I'm handing out.
Okay.
There's an exe.
So it looks like the cache drives also don't have a .msi file for installing whatever, I guess that's on OS X. So cache drives won't help you, unfortunately, in that regard. Even the ones that do have the installers cached properly. Hey. virtualization is very complicated, and there's a series of reasons that aren't worth getting into about why it kind of has to do with a certain stack at the moment. Mainly because we're doing nested virtualization, and it's just tricky. But yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. I just want people to. The idea was for we just to quickly install the software, and then we would teach about these things. But yeah, yeah. I've already tweeted them out too, I should say. For the people that are done, a few of you, I've already tweeted out my slides, so if you want to, that's probably an easy way to get to them. I think they're not currently on the slides page, so if you search for like dfarrell07 on Twitter, you can find me and get a link to the slides to start looking around while you're waiting on everybody else to finish up. Does anyone else need cached ones? These seem to have everything on it, like all the MSIs. I don't know why there's such differences. Yeah, yeah. So I'm seeing some encouraging results as I look around. I see people with what look like completed installs on their screens. At this point, I think I'm tempted to go ahead and start rolling, even if people are still waiting on some downloads. We have a lot to talk about. Yeah, don't run Vagrant up yet. I've not told anyone to run Vagrant up or Vagrant add or anything. Just run Vagrant status. You're going to kill the network. It'll start pulling stuff down. Do not run Vagrant up. How's this table doing? I'll use you as a micro poll. You're all set up. That's so encouraging. Trying. Yeah.
And I got a VirtualBox too.
I didn't hear you.
I have a VirtualBox.
Uh-huh.
I have on OS 6. You install the deb or the.
No, I think it's neither. So you don't have one with either of them. Try this other flash drive. I think this one has the MSIs and the.
But do we need the MSI? That's
So-
only for Windows, right?
Yeah. What you're on OS X, right?
I'm on OS 6, yeah.
Yeah, I actually have no idea what the file extensions mean for OS X and stuff. Yeah. No, not the deb. That's for Debian-based file systems. Neither of those are going to work for you. Try the ones on this one. Those are for Fedora and then Debian-based file systems. Cool. It's. Yeah. It's all right. It's.
The Vagrant DMG.
That's exactly what you want. Yep. Cool. Thank you guys for managing sharing these flash drives. I feel like that's the only way it's working. So my samples so far seem to suggest that we're doing pretty well. Can anyone want to refute that? Like, who is not ready? Who is not ready at all? One or two here. Seriously though, please raise your hand. I need to know who's not ready. All right, so pretty few. Cool. Uh-huh. Interesting. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I haven't used Windows in a long time. I don't really have any debugging help for you. Do you want to try like the locally cached version? Like maybe you have a different. So this flash. So I mean, mean, kind of the only advice I can give is to make sure you have the versions that we're trying to use here, 5.0 of VirtualBox and 1.7.4 of Vagrant. And as far as I know, it should work otherwise. Okay, well, so if you want to try something newer, the newest ones are on there. And they should be fast since they're already cached. Sure, so grab a USB key, this one. Okay, good. So, and then your objective is so there's all those files. You're going to install them, and you'll overall want to install Vagrant and VirtualBox. You probably already have Git and the ability to work with Tor. So Vagrant's what you need to install then. Cool. I'm going to go back and teach about them in a minute, but right now we're just kind of, there was a problem involving distributing things on the flash drives, and so it's taking longer. But we're hopefully almost done. No, just so install Vagrant via whichever one of those is relevant to you. Yeah. Yep. And then from then, you'll want to untar that tarball onto your local system, and then navigate to that directory and run something like Vagrant status to confirm that things are working. Don't run Vagrant up yet. Oh, God. I'm still parsing. Errors in configuration. That looks like, what? Man, you're having weird provisioner issues. I've never seen provisioner issues like this. I mean, so obviously the issue is that it's not like talking to VirtualBox. Basically, it's not using VirtualBox as its backend virtualization solution. I have no idea why, and I'm probably not gonna be able to sit here and debug why, unfortunately. Yeah. I'm sorry about that. I really don't know what's going on. In general, that's the issue. Okay, so I think we're gonna go ahead and start moving. I think there's maybe a half dozen people who don't have everything working, but there'll be a few minutes before we actually start running, serious commands, and we can come back to that. But we do need to get moving, or we're not gonna be able to cover everything else for everybody else. So if you want to turn on my mic, cool. Okay, so again, hopefully we're all basically at this point where we can run Vagrant status and see these virtual machine definitions. And now why I've been telling you not to run Vagrant up is because I want you to do this step first, which is adding a locally cached box. And so basically what this is you have this pre-built virtual machine in the form of a .box file provided for you in that tarball, in the root directory of that tarball. This will tell Vagrant that it exists and that it should work with it. So go ahead and issue this exact command, VagrantBox add, and then the name is important, that this is identically the name, and then obviously that's the path to the file that we want to import. And that'll take a few minutes because it's just a large data transfer. It kind of depends on the size of your, or speed of your hard drive. Hey.
People are keeping the USB from one session to another, or you're collecting them every time?
I have no idea.
Some people are asking, so I don't know. If people is going to stay later for the next session, you can keep the USB for the next session. If people are willing to go to the developer or someone else, it's good that you can, copy the file if you want, but then give the USB to someone else that can, especially there are new people coming in.
So, yeah, to restate that, it seems like these USB keys are meant to be for this particular room, now that I've gone around and actually seen what's on them. So try to keep the USB keys to this room. And you'll get other ones when you go to other rooms. Okay, so once you have that, it should be pretty much done importing by now. This is your next command, and this will take a while too. But then once you issue this, we're gonna move on with some teaching for a while, and we'll kind of let that run in the background, and then hopefully we'll have a running virtual machine here in a second. So I'll do this one with you actually. So I can time it. Who had a question? Hey, can you turn my mic off? Or is that not the correct path? Is this in your current directory?
Yeah.
It's not tabbed completely. Confirm that that's the right path to it, because otherwise it's right. Yeah, it is. Huh. That doesn't make any sense. Invalid optional specified. What option could that be? Vagrant Cache, RNT, box add. Let me go pull that up real fast. Okay, so is everyone kind of successfully importing these things? Is computation happening? I got to stop running off the stage, though. You need to, this is totally my fault though. Before you do that Vagrant up step, run git pull in this thing and you'll get some updates. It's just a naming issue. You could also fix that by naming, instead of in the box add, instead of naming it packdep, name it dfarrell07/packdep, and that will also fix it. But if you run git pull, you'll get those updates. I definitely recommend doing that instead. Git pull, you're in a Git repository. So this tarball that you unarchived is a Git repository. So if you run git pull, you'll get all the updates. Okay, then I also know how to fix that. So instead of this packdep word, use dfarrell07/packdep. Just do this exact command, but dfarrell07/packdep. That'll avoid you touching the network. It'll do all the caching correctly. I'll write it. I'll just edit the slides. Sorry. dfarrell07/packdep. Yep. dfarrell07/packdep. So that box add should work without touching the network, hopefully. If you're touching the network, something's going wrong, and let me know. So now that you've done this command, all of this other stuff is irrelevant. So try doing your other things again, like Vagrant up again. Yeah. That shouldn't happen again now that you've added it properly. That's what you just fixed. Yep, you're going to need to untar that. Everything else is in there. And then from that, that's kind of the environment that we're working from. Probably. What's up? You're not in a directory. You need to change into that packed up directory. You're in the wrong directory. Yeah. So many questions. You need to use exactly the name that I provided or it will not work. You cannot use your username. It has to be exactly this name. The idea is to trick Vagrant into not touching the internet.
Git repository access right?
When you do that, it'll fix it for you. When you once you run Vagrant up cache at this next step, there's logic in there that'll fix it for you. So again, once you've done this box add command, you can go ahead and issue this Vagrant up cache command. Make sure you've done your box add correctly such that you're not touching the network. Yeah, yeah. If you just go to like, let me unminimize this and you'll be able to see it. Or unmaximize this. Yeah, and so when you run that Vagrant up cache command, it's going to take care of the Git commands that you needed, I think. There's a chicken and egg problem there. So for the people that are thinking about Git things, if you look at in the tarball, there's a directory in all Git repositories called .git, and in all Git repositories there's a file there called config, and then in all config files there's the URL that you're working with. This part should be an HTTPS URL. So you may need to manually modify this if you're running into Git, which you probably will run into Git issues. So sorry about this again. It has to do with versions we've distributed, but edit that file, change it to be this HTTPS URL, then run git pull, and you'll get these changes. And then everything should continue to work, but it's not gonna. The changes aren't gonna happen in the Vagrant up step. You have to do that manually. Sorry. It's a chicken and egg problem. If you could get the changes, then they would happen in the Vagrant up step, but you don't have the changes for them. Yeah, you get what I'm saying. You mean the URL for the file to edit, or the path to the file to edit? So you don't need the URL for git pull. You just need to edit this file, git config, so this file, and then you're going to want an HTTPS URL here. For you guys, it probably currently appears as a git at something at github.com SSH URL. You need to edit that if you don't, because you probably don't have everything configured properly for that repository for it to work. If your Vagrant up cache is working, then it shouldn't be a problem. Honestly, I'm a little, it's trying to think why that would, this is hard to reason through on the fly. You can go ahead and do it at the same time as it. There's no reason to not do it in parallel. Yeah, just go ahead and do it in parallel. That's better. You can do this editing of the Git stuff at the same time you're running Vagrant up cache.
No, I'm not able to run the cache application.
Yeah, I don't know what you've done up to this point, but. Like, can you guys work together? I really need to start teaching. We got to get past this step now. So quick show of hands, who kind of has this stuff running, or at least like computation is happening? It doesn't have to be complete. The idea is not for it to complete now. We want to like get this running and then move on and teach for a while it runs. Who doesn't have, who is like, doesn't have all this ready at all, is totally behind, would feel bad if I started teaching? Okay, all right, that's pretty few. I'm sorry for those people, but we're gonna have to move on. That was like 5 people. So Lewis and JMO can keep walking around and helping you with things.
Are we running this again? Because we just ran that, right?
I mean, if you've run it once and it works, then you don't have to run it again. The steps that you need to do are add the Vagrant box, potentially modify the Git, or do modify the Git configuration so that when you pull, it'll actually work, and do that Git pull on your local system, or and do that Git pull so you get all the changes to the Vagrant file. There's only 3 steps: box add, modify the Git stuff, Vagrant up. The Vagrant up part is going to take a long time computationally, and we want to just move on and teach while that's happening. Trying to get everybody to that point so we can move on. All right, and I'm going to just start working under the assumption that we're good to go there. Okay, so cool. Sorry again that took so long. That was a frustrating detour. So let's dive into one of the more important packaging things that Open Daylight serves up. It's kind of the foundation of how we do a lot of our installs. It's Open Daylight's RPM. So here it is, hosted on the integration team's repository. It's also, let me full screen this, sorry. It's also served up via Copper, which is a service via Fedora for hosting things. And then we're also in the process of moving it to the community build system managed by CentOS. So it'll be available in the CentOS Extras repository. And that's a Koji-based repository. So I'll walk you through a quick, this is intentional where I'm going to show you some examples while we wait on you to be able to run examples. So I'll show you a few examples of doing some installs based on the RPM. So on the Copper web interface, which you could find, but I'm not going to actually show you by just searching like Copper Open Daylight, there's a number of links to .repo files. And so with Yum, maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not. But the idea is that you can install directly via RPMs that are cached locally. You can install via URLs to RPMs, or you can install these .repo files that tell Yum about where packages live and how to pull updates and how to check their GPG stuff and all of that. So we'll curl down one of the URLs there that's appropriate for our system. And now we have this magic ability to run Vagrant, Vagrant's on the mind, to run yum install -y Open Daylight, and everything just works. Again, we'll get to the point where we don't have to do that repository add fairly soon, hopefully, where it'll just be available in CentOS Extras. As a part of this RPM install, one of the things that we ship is some systemd support. So it's just kind of a magic file that tells systemd about Open Daylight and how to start it and stop it and how to tell whether it's running and things like that. So we get nice benefits like the ability to manage Open Daylight service without understanding the binaries in the bin directory. So system control start, for example, works. System control status, for example, works. So after we do our start, we can run isActive and get a nice little, hey, Open Daylight's running and it's managed by systemd, and we can all be happy about that. We can then do hopefully we're all familiar with Open Daylight's craft shell. So we can grab a craft shell via the client command like that. And now we're good, we're off. We can start doing featured installs and things like that. Or I should say, we're not going to do feature installs manually. We can kick to other deployment options that can do feature installs. We've laid down the files in the file system via the RPM. Again, we're moving this to the community build system managed by CentOS. So these are unofficial packages that are up there right now that I've been playing around with to get it working. Basically, we need this bug to be resolved, and then once this bug is resolved, we'll be good to go. So we may come back to this hands-on part if people are still, is computation still going on? Are people still waiting on things to boot? I think mine's done, but I started mine earlier than y'all. Who is not ready to do things with Vagrant? That's actually a drastically smaller number than I expected. And JMO and Lewis, if you could find those hands and help those people, that would be cool. Cool, so I'm gonna work under the assumption that you guys actually didn't raise your hand for the good reasons that you're actually ready, and we will do this hands-on. So before we dive in, I do want to show you the source repository real fast. So you guys are welcome to follow along here. If you search for Open Daylight integration, and then GitHub, you'll find a nice web interface. This isn't actually where we host our code, but it mirrors our code, and it's easier to look around. So in this packaging subdirectory, currently in this packaging subdirectory, we have all of the RPM configuration in this RPM subdirectory, and we'll come back to those Docker and Packer ones soon. Oops, randomly clicking on things. So there's some good documentation here about how to work with everything. There's also a few really critical files. The first one is this opendaylight.spec file. This is a RPM building specific syntax file that is pretty dense. It's pretty short, but it contains some dense logic. Basically, it tells you where the sources that you want to install are, and then it does everything involving Yum and package managing is like understanding versions and dist tags and stuff like that, and when to use the right ones. So it handles all of that logic properly. Another really important script involving sort of the hands-on part of RPM building is this build.sh script, go figure. And a part I would highlight here is that these are the versions of everything that we're going to be building. And then we have some sort of RPM configuration steps that are well managed by the Fedora packaging tool. So the setup tree command is going to do a lot of magic for us involving creating the right file directory structure, file and directory structure for building RPMs. And then we basically just curl down all of our artifacts that we want and run this RPM build command to BA, stands for build all, to build both a source RPM, which is, if you're not familiar with RPMs at all, they're basically just an archive of files and how to lay them out in the file system. And the source RPM contains the source for building binary RPMs that you could then do that with. And BA will build both the source and the no architecture binary RPM, in our case. So those are the most important ones. There's some other helpers like install and connect and uninstall that are good for verifying that things work. And then we've defined a really simple Vagrant environment here as well that the community can use to make sure we're all working in the same place when we're doing these builds and that it's consistent and reproducible and stuff like that. I've got two different slide decks going on. Let me close this one, sorry. Okay, so I did that, I showed you the source. So now we're gonna wanna go ahead and connect to our toolbox and we'll go start poking around. So notice the directory I'm in the untarred archive, and I have commands to the effect of vagrant status that should work. Because I ran that vagrant box add and vagrant up and fixed my git config, I have the cached virtual machine showing is running. So I can run, man, typing on a screen, on a thing in front of me here is hard. Vagrant up cached, vagrant SSH cached, and connect to the box. Again, if you're just looking at slides or later you're looking at the slides, I've tried to kind of include all of these steps in the slides as well, so you don't have to have me here teaching you to go back and review these things. So now if we navigate to this vagrant directory here, which is at root, we'll notice that we have this is basically a hard link to the directory that we untarred our tarball into. So how Vagrant sort of manages sharing files between the virtualized guest and the host is that it typically, using most providers, hard links the directory that the Vagrant file is in to /Vagrant. And then all the files there are the same files. They're not rsynced back and forth, even though you can do that with some instances of Vagrant. They're exactly the same files.
So I did Vagrant SSH
Yeah, so you're gonna have to change directories. This step here, cd vagrant.
Oh, my bad. It's not me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we can then, there's some source repositories here. So for example, the integration team, our code is here. And then we're gonna go to that directory that I showed you via the web UI, packaging, RPM. And so now we're here for everybody following along. And we have those scripts that I showed you. And so we're going to, make sure I'm updating the slides. Do a few minor tweaks to basically allow this RPM building stuff to work in a Fedora 21 system like we're using here versus the CentOS 7 based system that we ship for the integration team's RPM building purposes. So if you notice, I'm not going to actually run these commands because I'm now rushing pretty hard, but there's a couple of places that specifically mention the dist tag el7.centos. So we're going to want to replace those. So this is a fairly simple sed command to do that, sed in place. And then we're going to replace the string el7.centos with the string fc21. And we're going to run that against the build and install scripts. And now, if I run git diff, I can see that I've done those changes. And one more minor one to speed things along. So no, it would technically work now, but because we're rushing things, I would like to not build the binary RPM, or not build the source RPM, so we're just gonna build the binary RPM. So hopefully we're also following along. I'm gonna run one more sed command, another in-place replacement. So we're gonna replace the string RPM build.ba with the string RPM build /minus bb. And we're gonna do that against the build.sh script. So now if we run git diff, we see additionally that we've modified that. And so now we can kick off the actual RPM building process, which we do, of course, with the build script. There's an important, this is additional logic to avoid touching the internet, basically, that I've had to add recently. Thanks for submitting that pull request recently, guys. So we have to pass this path to the cache directory so we don't touch the internet. And then our build starts, and we're gonna kind of wait for that to complete for a minute. I'm willing to do a lap around if anyone needs any help at this point. Oh, sorry, it's also on the slides. So the idea is that, here's the command. Yeah, sorry about that.
So people can follow this in some place in the internet. This thing that is the tutorial itself is in some place in the internet. They can browse or something.
The box?
All these commands that you are running.
The slides are. Yeah, I've tweeted them out, if that helps.
Because some people are lost.
Already tweeted them out?
Are they?
I'll put a link to the tweet on the
Yeah,
integration.
a link to that presentation will be awesome. So people can follow them.
On the front page of the integration wiki, I'll put your tweet.
Okay. People, there was some discussion about finding the slides so people can follow along later. Again, if you look for dfarrell07 on Twitter, my most recent tweet was a link to the slides. So you should be able to find them there too. Okay, so that's running over here as we can see. And we can, again, I'm willing to take a lap to help anyone out if we're lost. I'm gonna take silence as like things are working and we're good to go. Okay. You're in the wrong directory. Go one directory further up. You're in the Vagrant Open Daily directory. Go one directory further up and that should work. Sorry. Thanks. Anyone else while our RPM's building? No, so I mean, just use any text editor that you want, and there's a directory here called .git, and then in there there's a file called all dot files are hidden. The idea with files starting with dot are that they're hidden. So running ls will not show you that file. ls-a or -a will show you the file. We're still building our RPM, so I'm willing to help other people along. You guys are doing better than I expected, giving all of this trouble. People seem to be actually kind of doing this. Good job, everybody. Thanks for sticking with it. Okay, our RPM's done, and there are no obvious questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. So notice if we run and view the ls-rc command, that's a great one, by the way, reverse chronological order, a good one to note exist. In this Vagrant Cache directory, and then look at the last file that we've created, notice that we now have this wonderful built for Fedora 21 binary, no architecture specific RPM that we all just created together. Is everyone vaguely on the same page? Okay, so you're still building? That's all right, we can slow down. But this will be the result that you get to once it's done building. I'm going to use you as a guinea pig. Are you done building yet? No. Okay. Tell me when you are, please. Anyone else have a question while we're waiting on builds to complete? So it's going to be down the integrations team's repository path. So if you go back to that shell you're in, cd integration, packaging, RPM. Yep. And then everything in there. Yep. Any other questions? I've seen your hand a bunch of times. I'm like, you're just so far away, you're kind of hard to make it to before somebody else intercepts me. Unfortunately, I don't know a lot about how Windows installs software, but it is an application. I'm not going to be able to be super helpful with that because I just don't know a lot about how Windows installs Vagrant. If there's a Windows user who knows something about Vagrant, these gentlemen could use some help with Vagrant. I just don't know a lot about Windows and how it manages Vagrant. Can you verify that we're in the directory with the Vagrant file that we care about? You don't have the Vagrant file. No, you don't want to be in that directory. You want to be in this directory, this one. Packed it up here. Yeah. You don't have the Vagrant file that you need. Yeah, that's why it's not working. I don't know why you don't have it, but did you completely untar it? Did you like finish the untar command? Did you do this sed command? Because it looks like it works, but it's looking for the wrong file name. So it did actually work. It's just falsely reporting that it didn't work because it's looking for EL7 CentOS. I just probably skipped the sed command or it didn't work. Can you run git diff and verify? Just run the command git space diff. Yep. So you changed the BA one, but it doesn't look like you changed the EL7 CentOS Fedora 21 one. All right, where's my guinea pig? Are the builds done? Whose build is done? Cool, a few hands there. All right, well, we're just gonna keep on plowing through at this point. Again, I'm kind of surprised that things are working as decently as they are, given our issues. So now let's go ahead and install OpenDaylight's RPM. So we have another helper script for this, the install helper script, if I can type. Again, we need to pass, it's important for not touching the network that we pass this Vagrant cache directory so that we work with locally cached artifacts. We already have Java installed on this PackDep Toolbox VM. So if you notice, we're now just sort of CPU bound, waiting on that install to happen. And that was moderately fast, so we're done there. We now have Open Daylight installed, so we can start doing things like working with it via systemd. So trying to keep slide commands up so you can see what I'm working on better. So we can run like system controls is active to verify whether things are working. We can also, like I'm going to jump to, start it. And now we can see that we have a Java process running, and we can connect to Open Daylight shell like that. And so here's, this is kind of our first big win of the demo hands-on part, I think. We just built Open Daylight's RPM from source and installed it on our local system, and now we're running our custom-built Fedora 21 no architecture RPM on this Vagrant box, and it's working and things like that. So cool, yay. I'm getting the impression that I should kind of just keep going with the slides, and you guys maybe should follow along there. Can I get some like rough consensus from people about, is that how you want to proceed? It's your tutorial, right? So I can keep going around and answering questions and getting everyone set up with Vagrant and VirtualBox. But frankly, because of our lack of caching and more Windows machines than I expected, that's taking longer than I expected. So I'm tempted to plow along with the slides. Is that okay with people? All right. Like, no one's voting, so I'm going to take this guy's opinion. Okay, so we can do some exploration, like running the info command here, by the way, just to complete that. So we can see that we're running the latest version that ODL has consumed of Carafe. We're actually running on Java 7, too, I think, which is good to know that that works. No, 1.8, sorry. Let's go ahead and stop Open Daylight to show you those commands as well. So the system control command, same one, except stop. And now if we run pgrep java, we'll see that we don't have Open Daylight running. And we can uninstall ODL's RPM like that. And that cleans off the system for the next time we install it via something else. Cool, so diving into one of my favorite deployment options. The Puppet module. So it's available on, right now it's available on GitHub under my personal user, because unfortunately Puppet kind of requires that Puppet modules are in their own individual repository, so it can't be a subdirectory of integration. We're going to eventually move this, as we'll talk about later, to some more official places. I guess I should ask, does anyone not know what Puppet is in general? Do I need to explain Puppet? All right, a few hands there, so I'll take a second, a little detour. So Puppet's a configuration management tool. So the RPM lays down the files on the system, right? It's about distributing these big files, putting them in the right locations, right directories, giving them the right permissions, and things like that. We then, after laying down the files in the file system, need to punt to something else to do some configuration. So things like, layers like Puppet or Ansible or Chef or Salt or whatever are sort of that configuration level abstraction, right? So they consume the RPM, or maybe a root tarball, but normally or a raw tarball, but normally the RPM, and they lay down the system using that, and then they go and modify certain files, for example, to configure Carafe features, or they open certain ports, or they manage services, or things like that. That's sort of the configuration management step that things like Puppet provide. It's also available in the Puppet Forge, by the way. One of the great advantages of the Puppet module is that it's super stable, and this is kind of why I like it. It's been around the longest, so we've had a long time to iterate on it. It's also very well documented, so let's take a quick scroll through the docs here. There's all kinds of info about how to use it, the features that you can, or parameters that you can pass to do certain kinds of configuration. There's great contributing docs as well. I work for Red Hat, so there's a big emphasis on community and stuff, and one of the reasons I got hired is building community effectively. So I care a lot about documenting how to contribute to things. So there's this great configuration, contributing document that describes running unit tests and system tests and testing continuous integration and things like that. Another great advantage of our Puppet module is that it has the best OS, broadest OS support of any of the available configuration management tools. And so we sort of typically target CentOS in the Open Daylight community. It's a lot of our build boxes run on CentOS, and so that's kind of what we hit first. A natural extension of that is targeting Fedora so that we can work with newer packages and prepare them for CentOS. And then we had some community folks come in that wanted to add Ubuntu support. So shout out to David from Orange, who was using the Puppet module as part of OPNFV and did a great job of working with me to get some pull requests merged and add Ubuntu support. You may be wondering, how are they doing that if we only have an RPM and not a Debian package? Well, we have a neat feature in the Puppet module where we can accept a raw tarball. So we can, for example, pass an optional parameter to Open Daylight's download page, or another optional parameter to a system deconfiguration file, which you shouldn't need, and do that install and kind of skip the RPM if for some reason you're just like religiously against using packages, which is probably not a good idea. The Puppet module is a really critical part of OPNFV. Do I need to explain that? Does anyone not know what OPNFV is? I think I'm going to stop trusting your hands. I don't think you guys are voting with hands. I'm just going to explain things as I believe. So OPNFV is the open platform for network function virtualization. It's about bringing together people who care about NFV to try to create a common ecosystem to solve those problems. It's doing, as you can see here, most of the network configuration work via Open Daylight and then via this Puppet module. So in this pretty critical file here, I guess I'll highlight both screens. In OPNFV, this is basically most of the network configuration that happens, and it's just a straight punt to Open Daylight's Puppet module, passing some custom craft features to install. Another thing that's cool about Puppet is that it has pretty good testing support. So there's a couple different testing tools in Puppet land, one of which is called rspec Puppet, as you can see there. It's kicked off with a command like bundle exec rake test. Don't worry, we'll do all these hands-on here in a second. At a high level, that looks like this. And so we're cloning down our dependency modules, our dependent modules, so other Puppet modules that we depend on, and then running a series of assertions about the system given certain inputs about the system. So if we're on CentOS 7 and we want to install these features and we want to open this port, then what's the resulting Puppet manifest that we're going to apply to the system, and is that correct? And so we have like 517 tests or something that do that at the moment with 100% test coverage, so woo, that's exciting. Best tested Open Daylight project. Puppet module's not an Open Daylight project, but it would win. In detail, what I talked about this some. We're pulling down our dependencies. We're running some syntax checks, just like, is this Puppet code valid? Is this valid Ruby code? And then we're running all of those checks about applying the manifests and stuff and asserting that the appropriate system state was laid down. So these are good. These are good for testing for basically unit testing our code and asserting that we didn't make like fat finger type mistakes while typing our code. But that's not really the kind of testing that I think we need overall. That's fine for quick iterations and good to run in continuous integration to make sure that get some initial verification. And we do some lint tests as well to verify that our Puppet module is well formed. But there's another testing tool called Beaker that you should be really excited about because it can make some really strong assertions about the resulting system state and give you a lot of confidence as a developer contributing to the Puppet module or someone consuming it. So Beaker's neat because it uses real virtual machines via Vagrant or Docker containers. And then it lays down Open Daylight on those virtual machines and then verifies the resulting state and repeats that for various configurations. So different craft features to install, ports to open or not open, operating systems, things that are broken about the virtual machine, all kinds of different things you can test. So at a high level, it looks kind of like this, where we're repeatedly applying Puppet manifest and then checking system states. In detail, we are bringing up a CentOS 7, in this case, virtual machine. We have support for all the operating systems that were listed there. And then we're installing Puppet on the CentOS 7 virtual machine, and then we're using the Puppet apply command and a path to a manifest, which is the fairly standard command to say, on my local system, take a Puppet module that defines a lot of logic and a manifest that defines the data that is consumed by that logic and make it all happen on my local system. And then we use a tool called ServerSpec to verify the resulting state. So we can, for example, check that Open Daylight's running using systemd's isActive command. We can check that the Open Daylight user and group were added correctly. We can verify that this file, which is a very important file, contains the appropriate text to install craft features. So if this works, then the feature should be installed correctly. And there are 51 of those examples overall, which is a smaller number, but still good coverage. So Beaker is really great as a maintainer of all these tools. If someone submits a pull request and it passes our acceptance test via Beaker, I mean, that means a lot, right? It passed all of our syntax checks and our basic RSpec Puppet test, and then we stood up like 7 or 8 virtual machines and applied it many different ways and asserted the resulting state. Like, you know, a whole lot of confidence that things are working properly if they pass our Beaker test. So quick example, using another toolbox involving Vagrant. This one's called Vagrant Open Daylight, and is drastically simpler than the one you're trying to work with. Basically, it defines a number of Vagrant machines that are provisioned using these tools. And so we can stand up a machine and install Open Daylight using the Puppet module, stand up a machine, install Open Daylight using the Ansible role, stand up a machine, install Open Daylight using a raw RPM, do that for CentOS 7 and Fedora 21 and Fedora 22. And so you get this sort of matrix of examples of how to install things. So we're going to reference these examples throughout. So at a high level, this is what one of those machine definitions look like. So if you've never seen Vagrant before, this is sort of the definition beginning block. Here's the ending block for a certain virtual machine, right? So we're going to say, let's base our virtual machine off of the CentOS 7 image. And then we want to install a few things. Puppet basically is what this is going to end up installing. Actually, I have these pulled out, so let's talk about them there. And then once we have Puppet installed, we can do a little bit of configuration. So Vagrant has this concept, two P words that are really important, providers and provisioners, right? So you've all been working with a VirtualBox provider and agonizing over that for the last hour or so to get that working. And that's sort of the back-end virtualization that's provided. And then provisioners take that virtual machine and then apply things to it and do the actual configuration. So there's like shell provisioners are the most basic examples that could run yum install -y, whatever, or Puppet provisioners that do things like we're about to see. So we're passing a path to a modules directory. Again, the term module applies to sort of like the Open Daylight thing that we've been talking about is a module. There's a Java module that manages installing Java. There's a tarball or archive module that manages working with archives. That's sort of a unit of composition in Puppet world. So we're telling the Vagrant configuration about a path to our modules. And externally, we can manage all of those modules if you're with a tool called Librarian Puppet. So it handles our configuration of modules pretty well. It uses this Puppet file to point at things properly, and we don't really have time to get into that. So the second part of the configuration, other than the modules path that I was showing in the virtual machine definition, is a path to a manifest file, which in our case is called odlinstall.pp. And this is basically the data or the extra parameters that we're passing to the logic, which is the module, the Open Daylight module. In this case, we're just installing one extra feature. It's kind of like a canary, arbitrarily picked OVSDB OpenStack. So let's go ahead and provision that box with a simple vagrant up name of box command, which you're becoming familiar with. Notice that we'll do things like install Open Daylight's yum repository, and then from that, install Open Daylight's RPM. We'll go ahead and modify some craft configuration files, which we would expect given that we passed an extra features param, so that when we boot, we have those features installed. So let's go ahead and connect to the box, Vagrant SSH into the box, and poke around. We can check that Open Daylight's running some. We can go and grab a shell and connect to it, and run the config list, and then grep against that command to assert that our configuration happened. So you notice at the end there, ODL OVSDB OpenStack. That was modified in a file and then read into Open Daylight properly, which is good. We can also then verify the next step, the feature list command, that ODL OVSDB OpenStack was actually installed. Notice the X there. The X implies that it's installed. So the configuration was both accepted and acted upon, which is good. End of that example. So moving into sort of comparing and contrasting the Puppet module to some other tools available, probably its biggest downside is its complexity. And this is not user-facing complexity, fortunately. This is sort of developer-facing complexity or people who want to contribute to it. From a user's perspective, it's just that manifest file that I showed you, right? That has the class, open daylight, extra features, a list, potentially like ODL port, a number. From a user, you're just passing in this very simple few lines of configuration. But from a developer standpoint, there's thousands of lines of kind of Ruby, but really domain-specific languages on top of Ruby code that we have to maintain and all this testing infrastructure. So it's just drastically slower to build things in Puppet than other tools, I think. Another con of the Puppet module is its ecosystem quality. So not our particular dependencies. I've actually done a lot of work to make them better, but in general, it takes a bit to make Puppet's dependencies stable enough for production consumption. So these are our dependencies. We depend on the standard library, the Puppet standard library, which is very normal, as well as an archive module that deals with like tarballs and downloading them and extracting them and stuff, and a Java one that manages installing Java versions. So here's an example of kind of what I'm talking about when I say ecosystem quality. The Puppet Forge reports all of these different archive Puppet modules, and they're all forks of each other. And there's not like an obvious linear path of how they were forked either. There's not like a top one and then they're all forks of the top one. There's a series of forks that are all tangled together, and they add features to different places, and they don't get merged back upstream. So that was frustrating. So I went through and submitted a bunch of pull requests to various ones to try to reconcile that environment and make them usable for Open Daylight. So that all works, and we have pretty stable dependencies, but it was non-trivial to get to that point. In the future for the Puppet module, we definitely want to continue supporting additional operating systems. So we have good support now, but we need to move to like Fedora 22, for example, is a big one. It would also be really cool to run the Beaker test against Docker containers so that we can do some caching, which we'll learn about more as we talk about Docker, to basically make them run faster. We're also moving this to a more official place. These question marks can kind of go away, really, because we're in the process of doing it. There's a number of RPMs that just package up Puppet modules, and then they're used by a lot of OpenStack folks for doing deployments. So there's talk among that community about including this Puppet module and those RPMs for distributing it. We also may put it on OpenStack's Stack Forge, and if Open Daylight ever gets our Forge built, we may put it there too. So I think we're going to try this hands-on. Let's do it. This should be fairly quick and low risk. So I'll show you, again, the web UI, because I want you all to be able to find these things later. That's why I'm showing web UIs, by the way. So if you Google, with me if you want, Open Daylight, Puppet, or some misspelling of that, you'll find this first result here. D4L 7 is the Git repository, and then Puppet Open Daylight. I do suggest, you'll have the slides, but if you want to like star this or something to save it or bookmark it or whatever, worthy of trying to go back and find later, I think. There's some important directories here that we don't really have time to dive into in detail, but at a high level, the manifest directory contains most of the logic for doing like the install and configuration portions of Puppet's work. The spec directory contains all of the testing logic, or much of the testing logic. There's some helpers here. Ruby's really a fan of helpers. And then there's the Beaker-based testing is in the acceptance directory, and the RSpec-based testing is in this classes directory. There are a number of files and templates that we consume. So for example, a template to configure Open Daylight's carafe features is here. This is written in a language or syntax or something called ERB, embedded Ruby. And so everything here is just like normal text, except for this logic, this part here, that looks at a Puppet variable and then iterates on it to build the appropriate plain text list of features to install. So there's a super quick version of sort of how Puppet works and the most important parts of the repository, and you've hopefully now starred that, because I want lots of stars on my Git repositories. So let's go ahead and hop into the toolbox here. We should all hopefully have this up and running and a shell in it now, but if you don't, I guess I'll show you. So I'm back in this extracted tarball directory. I have my virtual machine running. Notice the running thing beside cached. Sorry, so not up. So I'll go ahead and connect to it again, grab a quick shell. So I'm in a home directory, but I, as normal, want to go, I should follow along with the slides. As normal, want to go back down to again, from the root, there's this Vagrant directory here. not in your current directory from root. And then there's the Puppet Open Daylight subdirectory there. So this is the source that we just browsed via the web interface. So from here, we can do all kinds of stuff, and things should still just pretty much work. So for example, we can run those, let's see. Can't talk and type. We can run those RSpec tests that we just showed a second ago, and it'll do everything that we saw. So I encourage you to follow along if you're not. But you know, these are, we cloned down all of our local dependencies fresh, and now we're doing those assertions about the local system, or about the compiled Puppet manifest. Sorry, it's here on the slides. Well, I thought it was on the slides. It's a bundle exec rake test. Bundle exec rake test. Sorry for it not being on the slides. Here it is. This is the command. So while we're letting people do that, take a second. So I'm actually going to skip this modification hands-on thing because we have like 30 minutes left and we have a lot of stuff to cover. So we could modify our tests and then rerun them, and we would see like a failure, for example. I'll walk you through it. So if we were to modify our test such that we just kind of broke one of them, so instead of using the appropriate, checking for the appropriate extra features, we check for a feature that definitely is not installed, the toaster, then we'll see failures. So we have all of these 537 passes and then one failure. And this is kind of what I really wanted to show you about it, to give you an example of the output of a failure. So it's verbose, but if you take a minute to understand it, it can end up being pretty good. It's irritating to not be able to point at one screen. I guess I'll just use my mouse. So it's kind of human readable. We can say that using the default features and then passing extra features, this file here, which is our craft configuration file, we're trying to assert that it's a file and that it's at this certain path and that it's owned by Open Daylight and then it's also in that group and that it has this content, right? And the content ends with ODL toaster, and that's not true, and so that failed our test there. So I guess that's an advantage of Puppet. It has pretty decent sort of test result reporting. Now we would revert those changes and test again to assert that we can, that fixing the changes does make the test start passing, but we don't have time for that, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and hop into sort of the, if I can use this term, sexy new configuration management tool that Open Daylight is, I guess, moving towards in some directions, the Ansible role. So again, Ansible, I touched on this when I was describing Puppet, but it's another configuration management tool, and so it consumes things like the RPM to lay down the files in the system, and then it does additional configuration on top of that. It's on GitHub, same reasons as Puppet. It's just required by Ansible Galaxy, to be an independent repository. So we may eventually move that independent repository somewhere more official, but it can't really go under integration, unfortunately. The huge advantage, by far the biggest advantage of the Ansible role is how incredibly simple it is. And so, Ruby I talked about, Puppet I talked about Ruby and embedded Ruby and all the domain-specific languages built on top of that. It can be kind of painful to write those thousands of lines of code and test code and stuff to get all that working. Ansible is YAML configurations. So it's not even a programming language. It's just, trivial YAML files like this. So this is kind of like the heart, honestly, the heart of the whole thing. Ansible has a concept of task, which are sort of units of work that you do. There's a main task, which is sort of the entry point, as we normally use the term main, into all the logic. And all this is doing is saying, like, if we're doing an install from a repository, then install Open Daylight from the repository. If we're doing install from a path, then execute that logic, and then do the craft configuration, the northbound port configuration, the firewall port configuration, and then start Open Daylight service. There are some other tasks that we could put here, but this is a simple version. And then those punts are actually really simple themselves. And so here's the one that manages Open Daylight service. It's consuming other pretty well-built Ansible logic called the service role. And then we're just passing a few parameters to that. Like we want the name Open Daylight service to be enabled and to be running. And so this is declarative, right? So we're not going through and like running bash commands. We're saying we want this final state of the system, and then it's enforced given whatever the current state of the system is, which is really nice. This is actually probably the most complicated task to kind of show you the other corner case, and it's not that complicated. Just still a few lines of YAML. It's doing a bit more work though. So this is using a template, like I showed you the ERB template that was doing the craft configuration. This is what manages that. So we're punting to some template Ansible logic, pointing at that template, and then once we've modified OpenDaylight's craft features, we need to do a clean restart of OpenDaylight. And so Ansible has a concept of handlers that you can notify to go do things. I guess it's a fairly common abstraction. So in this case, we're notifying 3 different handlers. One of them stops OpenDaylight, one of them cleans up OpenDaylight's craft features, and then another one starts OpenDaylight. For the deep dark OpenDaylight devs in the room, that's necessary for removing craft features, not adding craft features. So we can talk about that over here. All of this configuration is really short overall. There's like, line counts aren't a great metric, but there's 186 lines of YAML here. Like you could spend 20 minutes reading all the logic and have a decent understanding of what's going on. One of the reasons why it's so short is because Ansible actively rejects Puppet's style of testing. So these are quotes from the Ansible documentation. Don't unit test your playbook. They couldn't be much more specific than that. Ansible believes you should not need another testing framework to validate basic things of your infrastructure. Also pretty explicit. So there's no RSpec Puppet or Beaker equivalent in Ansible world. Beaker was nice. Beaker makes my life easier. Honestly, RSpec Puppet is probably about as much work as it's worth, so not a huge trade-off there. I'm not going to shed any tears for RSpec Puppet. The way that Ansible gets by with not having testing logic is that it does a really good job of failing fast and cleanly and being obvious with what failed. And that allows, the hope is that allows people, developers working with Ansible to focus on the deployment logic instead of focusing on the testing logic. And you get these results about creating things faster and them being simpler and stuff like that. So we'll do I'll show you a quick example. We're going to again use that Vagrant OpenDaylight project that defines this, in this case, this virtual machine via Vagrant that's even simpler than our last one. So we're again starting with the same CentOS 7 base box, and then we're pointing at, we're using the Ansible provisioner here, and we're configuring it with a path to the playbook that we want to apply. So, just to repeat myself to make sure everyone got it, Vagrant uses provisioners to modify the state of the system, right? Providers to provide virtualization, provisioners to do things to the system. Ansible is one of the provisioners. Puppet's one of the provisioners. Shell's one of the provisioners. You always have to configure them. This is the required configuration part. I just talked about that. So here's the playbook that we're configuring it to point at. Again, it's really simple. For any host that that's interacting with us at all, we want to, using the root, run or apply the role called OpenDaylight. So we can that'll happen magically when we vagrant up the box. That'll do all that configuration stuff. At a high level, that looks like this. I don't expect you to be able to read this. I want you to be able to look at the colors of this. Again, Ansible is so simple, you don't have to read. You can just kind of like play by colors. So the yellow ones mean that things changed. The green ones mean that things did not change. And the blue ones mean that things were skipped. So again, this is sort of the declarative benefit, I guess, of Ansible. Certain things don't need to be changed, and it has a lot of well-done logic about figuring that out, about asserting things about the state of the system and whether you need to make configuration changes or not. So kind of breaking those out, as we've seen a few times now, some of the changed steps were to install OpenDaylight's Yum repository, which we did manually in the very first example so far, and then install OpenDaylight from that Yum repository. We'll also do the craft configuration that we've seen a number of times now, and then we kick off those handlers that I talked about because we did the craft configuration. So it restarts OpenDaylight, does a clean restart of OpenDaylight. We'll then start OpenDaylight service. So if we connect to the box and poke around some, we can verify that OpenDaylight's running as we would expect. And I'm going to give a short example. So second, another different example of applying Ansible, we'll now go back and add an extra features parameter using the same arbitrarily chosen craft feature as our guinea pig. At a high level, we'll see that our output has drastically more green and drastically less yellow. So our yellow step here is that we change the craft features, which is what we'd expect given that we added an extra features parameter to our playbook. And then we kicked off those 3 handlers. Those were our only changes. And so all the rest of the logic around like port modifications and starting Open Daylight Service and managing that didn't have to happen because Ansible's smart. Puppet does that too. It just, anyway. They both do that. They're both declarative. I shouldn't give the impression that just Ansible does that. So same tests, same sanity checks. We're running, asserting that Open Daylight's running. We can grab a shell. We can run config list to view our configuration and then verify that it was in fact taken from the files and Open Daylight correctly. We can run feature list to assert that it was taken from that configuration and installed correctly. Third quick example with Ansible. By the way, the reason I'm doing some examples myself and some that you guys are doing are basically things that touch the network and things that require virtualization that we can't do. There's some serious constraints around running nested virtualization stuff for many of these and serious constraints around touching the network for all of these. So that's why some of these examples I can't help you do. For this one, for this remote install, I'll show or demo installing via Ansible Galaxy. And so there's kind of a repository software thing for Ansible that's a collection of roles. You can go easily browse them and find ones that you want. Same with the Puppet Forge. This one just happened to be called Ansible Galaxy. When you install Ansible, you get this tool for free, the Ansible Galaxy tool. Oops, sorry. You get this Ansible Galaxy tool for free, and its syntax is self-explanatory. You can figure that out. We'll do a little bit of configuration to tell it about this remote host, to tell Ansible about this remote host that we want to provision. So all I'm basically doing is in this magic Etsy Ansible host file, I'm naming the box, I'm giving its IP address, I'm giving the user that I want to connect as. And then behind the scenes, I've also run like the SSH key, whatever it's called, exchanging commands to put my SSH key on this remote box as well. So there's the same playbook. In this case, instead of host all, we're pointing it directly at the host that we just configured and named ODL box and gave its IP address. So this is some remote host off in the ether somewhere. And then we'll run that same Ansible playbook command, again, really trivial. This one's output looks like this. I think this is probably taken before I added the handlers, so sorry about that. But as we would, it's kind of the same stuff. We configured our features, we started Open Daylight. We can now go connect to this remote box and do our sanity checks that things work, and they do. So 3 different examples there to recap. First one, using Ansible as a Vagrant provisioner with everything default. Second one, going back and modifying that initial install to do a configuration change and seeing that Ansible can handle changes well. The third one, applying it to a remote system. In the future for Ansible, one of the big to-dos in the next, hopefully, couple of weeks is to add the ability to stand up Open Daylight clusters. This has been asked for a lot, and it's definitely something that we know that we need to have. So soon we'll have that, hopefully. I've hinted at this a few times. I have a personal desire to move OPNFV to consume Open Daylight via the Ansible role instead of via the Puppet module. This would be an order of months type goal, but it's because it's so drastically much simpler, and the other developers that are doing a lot of this integration, Tim Rosé and Dan Radaz, for example, are also bigger fans of Ansible than Puppet. We're definitely gonna need to expand our operating system support for the Ansible role before we do those things. So right now, we're just running against CentOS 7 because it's very new. I've only created this fairly recently. But we'll move to, it works, and I've done it against Fedora 21, but we'll add official support for Fedora versions, and then hopefully some Debian-based OSs. We'll talk about Packer more shortly, but right now we're consuming this Ansible role via Packer to build our Vagrant base boxes. It would be really cool to also consume this Ansible role via Packer to build our Docker images. Again, that's sort of foreshadowing. We'll come back to that. Another neat thing to do that we're going to talk more about during the dev forum part of this week on Thursday and Friday is stuff around getting this testing into continuous integration. So it would be neat in our deployment pipeline if we could somehow incorporate the Ansible role for a set of tests to verify that install works, and then run our integration test against that, sort of looking at next iterations of how our release engineering process works, basically. So this is probably my favorite demo, so let's definitely do this one. So we're going to do a hands-on with Ansible. I do, again, want to show you the source so that you can go back and find this. So if we search for Open Daylight Ansible, go figure, we'll find basically the same structure repository, same naming convention at least, and good docs and things like that. Super quick tour of the files system here. We have the handlers that I talked about. So the restart one, for example, and the cleanup carafe one. Close that. We have these tasks that I talked about. So here's, like the one that adds the Yum repository, and there's a number of other ones here that you can keep adding tasks and not using them, and then it's just kind of like a directory of common logic that you can share with the community. So there's some tasks there that we've written and worked, but we're not currently using. Let's see, these other ones aren't, the var is worth highlighting. So when you override variables via the playbook, these are the ones you're overriding. Remember, so when we passed that extra features parameter to the Ansible playbook, the thing that we overrode was this empty list of extra features. We also, we don't have time to get into this, but there's a set of default features that are also installed that are listed here that are always installed. But other things that we could override include the install method. So I actually had to add all of this logic so we could do this tutorial, so we could do cached installs. But it defaults to doing a remote install based on the repo, but you can recently added the ability to install from paths as well. And we default to a remote path, but we're going to override that in our example with a local path because we can't touch the internet. So I just showed that. And let's go ahead and apply it to the local system. So we'll go ahead and I already have a shell, so I'm not going to disconnect and reconnect. But go ahead and get a shell on your packed up toolbox if you don't already. And we can verify that we'll run a few Ansible commands to verify that the system is as we would expect. Ansible galaxy list, list spelled correctly in our case. And notice that we have the 0.4.0 version of the Ansible role, which is good. We are now going to create a playbook file, and so I'm going to cheat and start with one that already exists. But we're creating this playbook file on the right now. I gotta remember this path. Vagrant Open Daylight Provisioning Playbook. So I'm making a copy of that in my sort of, oops. Sorry, I actually wanted to do that in my home directory. Cool, so now I have this playbook file in my home directory. I'm gonna go ahead and edit that and make it like the one on the right. So we're going to do this install against localhost. And we still want to run it as root, of course. We need to modify this name to be the name that's used by Ansible, the I guess, convention around naming that's used by Ansible Galaxy so they can find it correctly, since we installed this via Ansible Galaxy. And we'll need to override the install method param so that we can do a local install.
Sorry, and you mean for this YML file that you present in the backed up directory already?
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
Is this supposed to be in the backed up directory already, the YML file?
No, so I can, you can type it up fresh if you want, but what I did was, so I'm connected to the box. This is all inside of the packed up virtual machine. There's an example, the one that we've been working with that I've been showing over and over again, the playbook and the Vagrant Open Daylight directory. I copied that as an example. So here's the path. This is the command that I use. In the Vagrant Open Daylight project, there's a provisioning directory, and then in there's this playbook.yaml file. I just made a copy of that to my home directory in this packed up toolbox and was working from that. I think that answers the question. Cool, so we can now go ahead and pass up the correct local path. I'm gonna type it because all of you can't copy and paste either, so. Open Daylight 3.0.0. Tell me if I make a typing mistake too. All right. So we have this new playbook that we've just written. We can apply it. We should apply it. It looks like I typed something wrong. 3.2. Vagrant cached open daylight. CentOS new arch. I guess. Yes, I should just copy and paste. It's a typing mistake, but. Okay, so we're running that install now, and notice that we're CPU bound, which is good. That's what we would expect. We're also not hitting the network because we're doing that local install. Did you want me to cat out that file or show you the file contents again? Here's the file. So on the left side here, we just saw that completed. Again, it's all local, so it's just computation and local data transfer bound. We're basically seeing the same type of output that we've seen a number of times, so I'm not going to jump into that. But I do want to kind of take a second because I see people still typing. I'm going to continue using you as my guinea pig, sir, if you don't mind. How's it going? All right. We'll leave this up for another second or two. Yep, and then we'll run it again with this Ansible playbook, and then the path to the playbook command. All right, and I'm gonna kind of work under the assumption that we're good there because we do need to move on. So we saw all of that output at a high level. I'm not gonna do the modifying vars and reapplying role because we only have like 12 minutes left in the talk. But we could do that, and we would see the same. It's intelligently making the changes it needs to make, but not the changes it doesn't need to make. So in this case, if we did a craft configuration file change, we would see something like this, where we just modified that part of it, not everything else. We could grep around on our file system to find the right file and verify that our toaster is installed there at the end. Cool, so again, kind of accelerating things a little bit, but I think we're gonna do decently time-wise. We're moving on to the next packaging tool, Docker, which we're all familiar with. So OpenDaylight's Docker file is defined in the integration team's repository. So it's under the directory integration packaging Docker, as we saw earlier. There's good decent docs there about how to work with it. It's also available on Docker Hub. For now, under my unofficial account, that's another thing hopefully we can work out during the dev forum this week is to get some official OpenDaylight accounts created. We have a really cool example that we can do with Docker that we'll do hands-on in a second. That probably demo-wise is one of the sexier things that we can show OpenDaylight deployment via OpenDaylight deployments. It's a one-liner, right? So this is the only, if you have Docker installed, this is the only command that you would need to run at all, no other dependencies. And it will go and pull OpenDaylight's Docker image from Docker Hub and start it, and it won't have to build it, and it'll default to running the bin carafe command to drop us into an OpenDaylight shell. So with that one-liner, we get all the download steps that you can see here, and then we end up in a carafe shell. So as far as deployment options go, in my opinion, that's one of the sexier ones around. We can then see that our container is running, sorry, I should do that slower. We can see that our container is running, so it has this name, and that's the command that we ran. I should note that images versus containers in Docker is kind of an important distinction. Images are static, containers are running, terminology issue. So I'll also walk through an example of building OpenDaylight's Docker image. It's equally simple. So in this case, we're using the Docker build command instead of the Docker run command. And our -t flag, or -t flag, is the tag that we want to tag the resulting container as into an image. And the dot at the end is really important. That's saying use this directory as the build context. So the dot, or the directory that we're passing has to contain a Docker file, and that's used as the sort of relative root path while doing all of the Docker build steps. So at a high level, it looks like this. I should full screen this. Where it's a series it's a layered file system. If you're familiar with Docker at all, you've heard about it being a layered file system. And so for each command in there, it's building a layer of the file system. And then, if nothing changes for future builds, you don't have to rebuild that. And that's one of the advantages one of the many advantages of Docker. It's also pretty lightweight overall. It's a couple hundred megs once it's built. So we're starting, in this case, from a Debian 7 base image. At the time, Debian was shipping much smaller Docker files than like Fedora or CentOS. That's no longer true, so there's no reason to continue doing that. We're installing Java as our second sort of base layer thing. And then we're doing a very basic RPM or tarball-based install and opening some ports and starting Open Daylight service. We're currently lacking systemd support. When we talk about Packer, we'll talk about how we're going to fix that. So I should note that OPNFV has a number of different installer projects. One of them is using Fuel, and they have requirements around virtualization and containerization that wouldn't work unless they used basically a Docker image. And so they're consuming this Docker image to do all of their work. Or maybe consuming it and building on it. I'm kind of rushing along. We're going to eventually have official accounts on ODL, on Docker Hub to host all of these things. We'd like to host them on Open Daylight's infrastructure as well. It'd be cool to do iterative builds of Open Daylight releases, like weeklies and nightlies, and then distribute those for people to test. And we eventually want to move to using Packer. So I think I'm going to have to skip this hands-on. Maybe we can loop back to it, or I can do it with a subgroup of you later, but we don't have time for it at the moment. But basically what we would do is that one-liner that we'd all be awed by this one-liner, and then we would build Open Daylight's, build Open Daylight's Docker image with that same build command, and everything would be cached, and it would happen immediately. No big deal. All right, so talking about the Vagrant base box now, we've been working with Vagrant, right? And those box add commands and stuff, those are working with base boxes. And so that's saying, I want to start with this virtual machine file and then do other configuration on top of it. I'm starting with this base and doing other things on top of it. And so Open Daylight, it's really awesome for us to distribute a Vagrant base box because then all of that logic is abstracted away from everyone else, right? So we can manage that box building in a really contained place upstream, and it'd be really well defined. And then we just ship that to everybody else, and you just say, I want to create a Vagrant file starting with Open Daylight Helium or Lithium version, whatever, and then do your custom stuff that you care about, and everything is already wrapped in properly and installed and configured properly from that Vagrant base box, and you don't have to think about it. That's kind of the use case here. So it's available on Atlas or Vagrant Cloud. It probably has the coolest user experience overall because we can do stuff like this. This is what I was talking about with just starting with a Vagrant file. And then we can run a simple Vagrant up, and our machine is running, and we can connect to it, and Open Daylight is already working. So it's not quite a one-liner, but it's another really, really good first user experience example of how to deploy Open Daylight. In the future, we're all using VirtualBox, as you know painfully. It would be great to support some other providers. libvirt would be good, because then we can do nested virtualization better. And other operating systems. Right now we're shipping CentOS 7, which frankly is really what we care about the most because all of our build infrastructure uses it. But we just community-wise, it'd be great to support other things. It would be good to move some, there's various Vagrant files like the tools VM and Open Daylight that we should base off of this. We also want to use an official ODL account and again, integrate this into the build system as much as we can. So we're probably going to rush through this hands-on again too. Again, I'm totally willing to sit aside with you guys later and do these other hands-on that we're having to skip. So we would do the same type add command, pointing at the box and naming it Open Daylight in this case. And then it would take a while to import, and we'd add the box. We could then make a little sandbox directory and run a vagrant init dash. The M is for minimal. Don't add a bunch of documentation. A vagrant init Open Daylight command, which creates this trivial vagrant file, and then we can stand it up and see that it's stand it up and see that it's working, and connect and verify that ODL is running as we would expect. When you go back and look at the slides, do note that the password is caraf when you connect. Because it doesn't have a script to help you connect. So we're just disconnecting, closing the box, things like that. Cool, so Packer is in our last few moments, is a really sexy new thing that we've moved into recently for building the Vagrant base box. It's basically a tool that consumes a lot of build artifacts and the logic around those build artifacts, and then does a series of build steps and then outputs other types of build artifacts. So in this case, we're consuming an ISO, we're using some logic via Packer, and then we're outputting the Vagrant base box. So it's available, again, under the integration team's repository, integration packaging packer. It's quite simple as far as user experience, doing it wise. It's just packer build and then the name of the configuration. At a high level, it looks like this. We stand up a very fresh CentOS 7 virtual machine from their distributed ISO, which it pulls and checks the hash sum of and stuff. Rushing, we are, again, pulling the ISO. We're doing the basic operating system configuration stuff, low level, like partitioning and things via Kickstart templates. And then there's this packer logic that has provisioners like some shell scripts to install Open Daylight and things, or actually in this case, to do some VirtualBox specific configurations. And then we punt to the Ansible role, which we've already learned about, to do the Open Daylight install and configuration, which in turn punts to the RPM. This is the outputting part of that, so it's a post-processor that compresses the resulting VirtualBox image and outputs it and formats it, I guess, as a Vagrant box. We then created that Vagrant box there, and we can add it in the way that we're becoming familiar with now, hopefully, as we repeat, and stand it up with Vagrant up, and connect to it, and do our basic assertions that things are working. One of the huge wins of Packer is that everything is in version control. Everything is a text file in the integration repository, or a URL to some well-known place. So it's just a big win as far as, that's always a win as far as distribution artifacts go, and asserting that they're what we expect them to be. So we can do things like get blame and get log. Our configuration is all handled by Ansible, so we get all the power there. There's tons of room for growth with Packer, so we can build containers like I've hinted at a few times. We can use additional versions, operating system versions and ODL versions. Again, we would love to integrate this into the build system. We're not going to do a hands-on with Packer because virtualization, nested virtualization is hard, and there's no way we can get around to that today. I'm actually also going to skip some of this review stuff. We built Open Daylight's RPM and installed it. We explored the source trees and learned about the Puppet module and saw examples of Puppet testing, and then you actually ran some RSpec Puppet tests. You learned about Open Daylight's Ansible role and saw examples of the Ansible role being used as a Vagrant provisioner and then as a remote host, against a remote host. You applied it to your local system. We learned about Open Daylight's Docker image. We tried to run the magic one-liner, or would have run the magic one-liner. We would have built Open Daylight's Docker image. We learned about Open Daylight's Vagrant basebox, and then stood up the Vagrant basebox, or would have. We learned about Packer. And I told you about the future of kind of everywhere we want to go in this ecosystem, with the sort of unstated assumption that come help if you want. You're welcome to contribute or help drive those directions. So in conclusion, Open Daylight has a really rich deployment toolbox and ecosystem. We've kind of touched a lot of the important parts of how to do packaging and deployment now during the Lithium cycle, and so we'll make iterations on that, but frankly, like we're doing pretty decently in that space. These are reusable, composable building blocks is the idea. So you should take the subset of these that you care about into your environment and your deployments and build them on top of each other, like the RPM, or Ansible role builds on top of the RPM. As an example, and kind of build up the logic that you want. And Packer can build on top of that. This is basically required for modern automated deployments, things like OPNFV. There's no way we can do this manually. It community-wise enables drive-by exploration because it's easy to verify that this is the install that we meant and that it's working because these test cases passed and stuff like that. So that's a community building win. There's definitely a big focus on quality and documentation and testing and things like that. And the ability to contribute is well established in the docs and via lots of pull requests, and so please do come contribute. Here's all my contact information. I tweet about all of this stuff a lot, and again, you can find my slides there. I'm dfarrell7 everywhere, like on IRC, so feel free to ping me there. And I'll be around the conference all week. I apologize for the issues with the flash drive and how long that took to get everyone installed and working with VirtualBox and Vagrant, and then that we kind of missed a few demos because of that. But thank you for your patience during all that process. You did surprisingly well. I'm honestly surprised that given those issues, so many people seem to have got it running. So thanks again. I'll let you go to your next tutorial. So who has everything installed and is good to go? The download's taking forever. So Casey is the guy who wrote the flash drives, has gone to try to find flash drives that do have everything on it. So maybe we'll be able to come back and do that. I guess for now, if anyone has it, okay. he has Vagrant on a drive. VirtualBox we need to distribute amongst ourselves somewhere. I'm really sorry for this lag, by the way. This is irritating to me. Yes. Yeah, so don't do this step yet. Yeah, so don't do that yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I need to teach you other things before you do that. And please stop it so you stop killing the network. You're killing the network right now. If you're downloading something over the network and you don't need to be, please stop.
I've got a few keys right here, about 10 that have the installers on them. If you need them, raise your hand.
Okay, so now you should be able to run up with the provisioner VirtualBox, and it should just stop looking at libvirt. No, there's a provisioner. You'll have to Google this for the syntax because I don't have it in my slides, but it's a provisioner flag, and it'll point it. No, it's still a Vagrant up command, and there's a -- provision or provisioner VirtualBox. But if you Google like the Vagrant, search for like Vagrant provisioner VirtualBox or something, and then that'll show you the right flags. But I guess the issue is that on 22 it's just defaulting to look at libvirt instead of looking at VBox. So you just need to tell it to use the VBox virtualization provider, and then it should be fine. Yeah, it may be a global thing like that too.
All right. So I should delete these things that I installed. These guys, I want these.
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, I didn't download this.
It's not for me. There are other tutorials who have stuff on those drives that I know nothing about, but. Are you downloading it? Yeah. Are you getting it? Is it slowly coming down? Yeah, very slowly. Yep, Vagrant and VirtualBox. So the. Okay, good, cool. Good, good. Yep, that should be what you want. So are those flash drives with everything actually cached on it? Are those being distributed effectively? Because we want to get those on and off your hands as quickly as possible. I did not expect this to take nearly as long as it's taking. Yep, so you'll need overall all this. Yep, this is exactly what I would expect. Good.
Directory, and I copy that tar file in the directory,
That's fine.
and then I can do Vagrant in it right there.
Yeah, so once you have it untarred, you'll have it's a Git repository with a Vagrant file defined in it. So if you have everything installed, then you'll be able to run Vagrant commands.
Okay, so
And I'll teach you about that shortly. How's it going over here?
Hey, I got VirtualBox since before. I'm just trying to get Vagrant.
Yeah, is it just downloading or?
Trying to do both, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you have one of the keys that allegedly has it?
Allegedly, but
It's not
I
working?
couldn't get to it.
Really?
So maybe
Interesting.
it's my
Somebody else want to try? Do you want to try? Okay. This is one of the keys that should have things cached on it, allegedly. If anyone wants to try it. Maybe. Anyone? Someone has to need this. This has everything cached on it. If you're waiting on a download, you should say, hey, I need this. And install and stuff. Now we can try again to start up in daylight, and that worked, but we're running as root, so that's fine for some stuff, not great for real deployments. So I guess now we need to create the ODL user group. Do we want a home directory for that user while we're doing it, and other settings and questions you have to figure out? Now we need to go change all the relevant permissions to be appropriate, and then restart the ODL service. If only we had systemd support, that would be really nice. Now we've got to manually log into the craft shell and configure some craft features, do any port configuration, both in Open Daylight's port stuff and through the firewall, and all that's great and fine for devs. But for automated deployments, especially like big, complicated automated deployments like OPNFV, for first user experiences, modern users, in my opinion, expect better, and we definitely need better for modern automated deployments. That was what drove a lot of this, and it's just a hard requirement of being able to do this in a better way. Cool, so with no further ado, let's go ahead and jump into what I suspect is going to be the least elegant part of this presentation, which is getting you all set up with your dependencies so that we're working in the same shared environment. So again, this is the PackDep toolbox that I'm not great at naming things, by the way, so PackDep is totally up for argument if anyone has a suggestion for a better name there. So it's on GitHub, but you don't need that because it's also cached locally on your system. It defines two virtual machines via Vagrant. One of them is the actual PackDep virtual machine that has a tremendous amount of complicated logic to do a lot of caching. The other one is a cached virtual machine that's fairly simple and hopefully will trade computation and network for lots of storage. And so you guys don't have to spend hours waiting on things to build, or we don't kill our network. So here's the painful part. These are the files that I've included on those USB keys that you all have. So you'll need to go ahead and install them. The ones, I don't really know how to help you with this, by the way, because you all have different operating systems. I walked around and I saw lots of Windows, I saw lots of OS X. I validated that this works on Linux and OS X. I've not tried it on Windows. Couldn't find a guinea pig. But overall, what you're going to need to do is install VirtualBox and Vagrant and Git and the ability to work with tar archives. And that's pretty simple compared to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dependencies that you would have to install if we hadn't have done the rest of this. So I apologize for this little detour, but once that's done, we'll be good to go, elegance all the rest of the way. So I'm going to walk around. Jamie can walk around. Anybody else can walk around that wants to help and try to answer questions. But we're going to have to take sort of a few minutes of non-presentation time to get that installed in everybody's system. Then we'll all be working from the same common Vagrant environment, and we'll be good to go.
For some of you, if it doesn't work on Linux, you have to put on expat queues and expat utils. That came up in one of the other sessions. I knew somebody might ask.
So if you could turn my mic off, person, I'm going to go walk around. And so let's take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get this done. If anyone's, as you get done, let me know, I guess. Or try to make that obvious so I know timing-wise. trying to do up here, you're going to end up untarring this large directory that I've distributed, and then if you can run Vagrant status, you probably have most things working. This is kind of your end goal. You guys have these files on your flash drives? All right, well that's exactly the opposite of what I was trying to do. Cool, so I need to go find the guy who wrote all of these flash drives and make sure that there's no magic going on, like we have the right flash drives and stuff. I don't know where he's at. So, yeah, this one should be here, so we can at least do that, but these are moderately large files, so I guess go ahead and attempt to download these, and we'll see if our network can support them. These are not like magic files, they're available on the internet and stuff. So if they're not cached locally on our flash drives like we hoped, then go ahead and hit the network and search for like VirtualBox installer, it'll be very obvious, or Vagrant installer, it'll be very obvious. And these are the files that you end up downloading and installing.
So before we go there, question for you. Is it possible that the tar file has something?
No, the tarball does, it has stuff in it, but it does not have these things in it. Then you're done. You don't have, if you have everything installed, then you don't have to install it. Wait till everybody else has it installed.
What I have here, there's 2 virtual machines here.
Can you turn my mic off? Here's all the VirtualBox downloads. They're maybe 100 megs or something. It's not too crazy, so we should be able to get them down. If anybody's actually downloading it and want to let me know whether the network is working, that'd be cool. Sorry about that. I definitely submitted all of those files to be put on the flash drive, for the record. No, it doesn't. I promise, I created it. It does not. Sorry about that. Slow down. Is everybody still making progress in general? Are we done? Guess this isn't clear. You don't actually have to load any virtual machine into VirtualBox at the moment. We're going to be using Vagrant to work with the virtual machines. And so don't open up the VirtualBox GUI and try to import a virtual machine. That's not what you want to do right now. Just get to the point where you can untar the archive and run Vagrant up, or Vagrant status. This is your objective. Do this. Don't try to import the virtual machine yet. I'll show you how to do that in the next slides. Progress check. Who has Vagrant installed? Who has VirtualBox installed? Okay, who doesn't have either of those installed and feels lost and like they're never going to get this done? All right, well, let's give it a few more minutes, and I'm going to go. I really would like to talk to Casey, who made these things. I'm going to go try to find him real fast. So you shouldn't need libvirt. I don't, I, what, I mean, yeah? Are you, it's weird that it's even looking at libvirt. Think for a second. Do you have, you have VirtualBox installed? Can you run, think for a second. I don't know, I've never had to install that. What OS is this? Interesting. Gosh. Can you try running like Vagrant up? No, you'll have to import it first. That won't work either. It's too complicated. Let me show you a slide real fast. So can you do that box add command right there and see if that works? Yeah, Vagrant box add, name of the box, and then the path to the box. Guy up front. JMO up here, the awesome ODL developer in the blue shirt. He has the box of flash drives. So he's the guy to get your locally cached files from. So as people are making their way in, again, I encourage folks, if it's too late now, but maybe during the break, if you realize you can't read the font or it's too crowded because I'm using too large of a font, please move closer. Then I can use a smaller font, and it'll be better for everybody else. Cool, so we're gonna go ahead and dive in. This is the title that I submitted was Deploying Open Daylight. The subtitle was Vagrant, Docker, RPMs, Puppet, Ansible, oh my. So that is that talk. It just was titled differently than I intended, and the long title doesn't fit on my slides. This is kind of a talk that I've been wanting to give for a long time. I've given a lot of packaging and deployment talks because we kind of led that charge during the last release cycle. But they're all like 45-minute ones, right? So I'm always jamming everything into 45 minutes. Can't really touch anything hands-on, which I think is pretty important for learning in that amount of time. So this is kind of the all things Open Daylight packaging and deployment talk that have been talked about over beers for a long time, and now it's finally happening. Before we do that, though, a quick introduction to me. Let me go ahead and full screen this so because we won't need the shell for a minute. So I code a lot. My name is Daniel Farrell. I'm a software engineer on Red Hat's SDN team. I code a lot on various projects. I'm a committer on Open Daylight's integration team, where I do a lot of coding and code reviews. It's a great community in general. I love robotics. I lead a robotics team at North Carolina State University and advise that team now. Sometimes I like talking about robotics over beer. In general, I love craft beer. Do a lot of beer tourism or other interesting drinks if alcohol is not your thing. I associate as a pedal biker in Raleigh, North Carolina, so there's a great biking scene there, great community. Highly recommend checking out our group rides at some point if you can. Sometimes I'm able to combine hobbies like biking and scuba diving on the right, or being outdoors and coding on the left. Cool, so super quick outline of today's talk. Again, it's kind of an all things packaging and deployment. So we're gonna touch on every relevant tool, every relevant packaging way, RPMs, Docker images, Vagrant files. And then I'll talk about it for a while, and then we'll do a hands-on part for each of them. The hands-on part is difficult in the sense that it's been difficult for me to get it all set up, so hopefully it won't be difficult for you. So hopefully it'll all work out super well for you, and all the dependencies will be locally cached, and we won't have to touch the network at all. But if anything breaks there, it's probably my fault setting up that dependency stuff, but not the actual tools. To do all of that local dependency caching and preventing you all from having to spend 5 hours installing things on your laptops, I've created a very simple Git repository called the PackDep Toolbox, Packaging and Deployment Toolbox, that contains some Vagrant file definitions. There's the toolbox that we'll be making use throughout the day. We're also going to be talking about Open Daylight's RPM, which is kind of the foundation of things. Open Daylight's Puppet module, which is widely used by OPNFV and stuff. Open Daylight's Ansible role, which is probably the future of how we're going to do that stuff with OPNFV. Open Daylight's Docker file and image and containers, which are a lot of fun and we're moving to do in more cool ways. Open Daylight's Vagrant Basebox and the Packer configuration that built that Vagrant Basebox and hopefully will eventually build our Docker images. All right, so before we jump into all of those awesome tools, though, I kind of want to contrast that with a lack of a deployment tool or the manual option. Again, for the people coming in, there's a flash drive going around. This box up here is full of them. Make sure that you have these flash drives. They have all the locally cached files on them. So the manual option in Open Daylight community terms is known as the just download and run option. And that works, that works sometimes, but let's go ahead and try it out and sort of get a feel for it. So for this, slide example at least, we're going to start with a fresh CentOS 7 Vagrant file, which you can create. I'm taking the time, by the way, to teach Vagrant syntax instead of my normal, or all syntax, instead of my normal, fairly fast-paced slides every few seconds. So if you see a pacing issue, that's what's going on. So we can use Vagrant init to create a minimal Vagrant file like this based on a CentOS 7 image upstream. And then boot that virtual machine with Vagrant up, and then connect to it with Vagrant SSH. We can then go grab our favorite download URL, which is Open Daylight's download URL, of course, and curl that down to our Vagrant Basebox. Again, this is the manual install process for Open Daylight for people who are just coming in. We can then make some relevant directories and untar our download archive into that directories, and then go and attempt to start Open Daylight, and we realize we don't have Java installed. So let's go install Java and wait for that to download.